This is your overview of the vertebral column. We'll start with this first typical vertebra. This is one of the hog vertebrae that I pulled out of the cabinet, but it shows all the parts very, very nicely. So let's start in the center at the top at number 1 and name that sticky outy thing. I know you know the name of it. If you name that spinous process, then you are correct. Let's move on to number 2. That was the transverse process. I knew you knew it. Number 3, of course you got the body. Number 4, yes, that's the vertebral foramen. Number 5, that's the bridge between the transverse process and the body, called the pedicle. And then number 6, which is the bridge between the spinous process and the transverse process, called the lamina. We also have the superior and inferior articulating processes, but they are seen better on another slide. So let's move on. Here we have the 3 basic types of vertebra. The first one was just a typical vertebra that showed the parts. All of these vertebrae exhibit those same parts. They all have the body, the vertebral foramen, etc. But now let's look at some of the characteristics of each of the vertebrae. This first one is the cervical vertebra. And there are 7 of those vertebrae in your vertebral column. It has some distinct characteristics. It has this little forked tail down here called the bifid spinous process, bifid meaning split. And it also has these little transverse foramina. That's right, for passage of a nice big blood vessel called the vertebral artery. Now let's move on to the second type of vertebra in your vertebral column. That would be the thoracic vertebra. This is the one we said looked like a giraffe. And there are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and these are the vertebrae to which the ribs attach. Some nice features on this that I really like would be these superior articulating processes with their facets, and from the underside, the inferior articulating processes with their facets. It has all the other parts, but those are the ones I like to use for my practical. Then we have your good old lumbar vertebra down here. And your lumbar vertebra has 5 components. They are unfused, unlike the sacrum, which is fused. So there are the lumbar vertebra. You can see that they are different in size and different in basic shapes. Here we have 2 special cervical vertebrae. So let me make sure you know those are cervical. And looking at the first one, C1, is also known as the atlas, named after the mythological hero who held the world on his shoulders, in the same manner that the atlas holds the head on its so-called shoulders, on its superior articulating processes, right here and here. It does have the transverse foramen, and it tried to have a bifid process. It tried to. Now the second one, C2, that is called the axis. This is the one that reminds me of the little bird holding its wings back and with its head up, and that head is called the dens. And you can see quite nicely on it the 2 superior articulating processes and facets, and it shows quite plainly its bifid spinous process. You cannot see so well the transverse foramina on that particular view. So that's C1 and C2. The rest of the cervical vertebrae are just called cervical vertebra. Here we have the sacrum. I probably should have let you say that by yourself because you knew that. And this is from an anterior view, the one on the left, and the one on the right is the posterior view. Because of the way this is photographed, you cannot tell that the curve on the anterior view is toward you, which is more like a concave, whereas the posterior is convex. So let's look at some of the parts on this that you should be able to label. One of the things that we can't see from this view at all, you really see it better from the top, is the body of that sacrum. It coordinates with the body of the lumbar vertebra that sits on top of it. But the leading edge of that on the anterior surface is called the sacral promontory. which just means the highest point on the sacrum. And on most of them it is. I guess if I hadn't laid it flat on a table to make the photograph and tilted it the proper manner, it would have been the highest point on that sacrum. Then we have the holes on the front through which nerves pass. These are simply called anterior foramina, or anterior sacral foramina if we want to be more specific on that. Foramina is just the plural of the word foramen. On the other side we have the posterior surface, and we have all these posterior sacral foramina on both sides of this ridge in the center. That ridge is called the median sacral crest. We have some nice superior articulating processes on the top with their facets. We have this hole into which the cauda equina of the spinal cord passes, called the sacral canal. And then at the bottom of that sacral canal we have the sacral hiatus. It is on the bottom down here that the coccyx attaches. Some other parts of that same axial skeleton is the sternum, of course, from top to bottom. The sternum has three main parts. The upper part, which I'll label A, is called the, you tell me first. I know you got it. That's the manubrium. That was the shield that the gladiator wore. Part B, body. In other language it was called the gladiolus, but we can do with body, which refers to the gladiator who held the shield. Gladiolus. And then part C, xiphoid process, which you have to know for clinical life-saving procedures. This is the last part of the axial skeleton, since I forgot to photograph the coccyx. Sorry about that. This is G. What could this be? Yes, it is. It's a rib. And it does attach to the thoracic vertebra on the posterior side and the sternum on the anterior side. It's also known as the costa, which is a good thing to know. Costa being plural.